Hello, I'm CJ Werleman. Please don't forget to subscribe to our show. Now let's get into it. Americans and Europeans are only just now discovering how they've been lied to about Islam, and also how the State of Israel is the primary source of these lies, which we will come to in just a moment. But first, let me speak about the International Court of Justice in The Hague, where South Africa has presented meticulous and damning evidence that has not only exposed Israel as a perpetrator of genocide, but also exposed Zionism as a genocidal cult, which has left the Zionist state isolated politically, diplomatically, and economically like no other time in its short history, which is making Israel even more vicious and desperate as it attempts to regain control of the narrative and restore the lies it has used to maintain international support for its criminal occupation and blockade of the Palestinian territories, with leaked Israeli diplomatic cables revealing the Zionist regime is set to use every propaganda tool at its disposal. And the number one tool Israel goes to when aiming to corrupt the minds of Western audiences in a time of political crisis is Islamophobia and lies about Islam.
Percent of the funding for the Islamophobic industry comes from pro-Israel sources. I have written a long article in the American Studies Association journal with my estimate that 70% of the funding for the Islamophobic industry, meaning organization groups and individuals that demonize Islam and Muslims, comes from pro-Israel sources.
Israel has dialed up anti-Muslim hate in the United States and Europe to levels that have been described as unprecedented and out of control. And it's doing so because Islamophobic rhetoric is often used by the Zionist state to both justify violence against Palestinians in Gaza and silence supporters of Palestinian human rights. Since October 7, the US and Europe have experienced a 200% uptick in anti-Muslim violence, culminating with the murder of this 6-year-old Palestinian American boy who was stabbed 26 times at his home in Chicago by his landlord, who was screaming anti-Muslim slurs during the brutal attack. And we shouldn't forget the Free Palestinian students who were gunned down by a crazed Zionist in the state of Vermont. But violence in the streets is just one aspect of this Israeli-manufactured Islamophobia. The other being how Israel is spending hundreds of millions of dollars to help elect Islam-hating far-right politicians in the coming US election. Remembering that it also helped elect Geert Wilders as Prime Minister of the Netherlands earlier this year, a man who describes Islam as a cancer and vows to rid Europe of Muslims. His government inspired a Quran-burning stunt in the Dutch city of Arnhem last week. Kudos to the courageous counter-protester who disrupted this hateful stunt. But Israel is pushing these events because it wants Europeans and Americans to believe that Islam promotes violence, terrorism, misogyny, and other ideas that are incompatible with Western democratic values. And it wants you to believe that because of this, Muslims and Palestinians constitute a security risk that must be mitigated by any means necessary. But the good news is this: that in record numbers, and thanks to the indomitable spirit of the Palestinian people, non-Muslims in the West now see through these Israeli-manufactured lies.
So, if you must fight, then strike only at those combatants who attacked you. Do not attack women, children, the elderly, or those retreating in their places of worship. Do not cut down trees or kill animals. Fighting against aggressors is allowed regardless of their faith. Fighting innocents is prohibited regardless of their faith. The Quran makes it clear that men and women are equal before God and before the law.
Israeli lies about Islam are literally falling apart because ordinary Americans are picking up the Quran and learning about Islamic faith for themselves.
You'll know that the religion of Islam does not promote violence. Let me read you this verse and you'll see what I'm saying. So in chapter 16, verse 126, it says, "If you retaliate, then let it be equal to what you have suffered. But if you patiently endure, it is certainly best for those who are patient. Be patient, O prophet, for your patience is only with God's help. Do not grieve over those who disbelieve, nor be distressed by their schemes. Surely God is with those who shun evil and who do good deeds."
Even more encouraging, Americans are now discovering how Islamophobia has been used to support crimes committed in the name of American empire, including the aiding and abetting of the criminal Israeli occupation and the war on terror.
So I've been doing a little thinking, and I think I understand why the American empire has such a problem with Muslims. And I'm not speaking about Americans in general who have been brainwashed by the media and by the leaders. Okay, here goes. Muslims fight back. There it is. Muslims do not allow themselves or others to be oppressed. And this is a problem when you're the oppressor.
As we reported in a recent episode, the nobility, bravery, and humility of the Palestinian resistance has inspired Americans and Europeans to convert to Islam in record numbers, with some scholars estimating that as many as 10 million people have converted to the Islamic faith since October 7th.
France alone, in one country alone, in a span of 2.5 months, this was a couple of weeks earlier, in a span of 2.5 months alone, more than 20,000 non-Muslims in France, they accepted Islam only after watching the clips of the atrocities that the Israeli army is putting on the Gaza.
This great Islamic awakening, and that's exactly what it is not only reshaping the Western world, but also derailing Israel's well-oiled propaganda machine, leaving it to crumple and die on the side of the road, as more people gain a clear-eyed understanding of how the Zionist state weaponizes lies and deceit to whitewash its war crimes and brainwash target populations. Put simply, people now understand how Israel manipulates its connection to Western civilization, while tying the Palestinians to Middle Eastern chaos and violence. They saw this for themselves when Israel tried and failed to conflate Hamas with ISIS, and when it shamelessly lied about beheaded babies and mass rapes. The court of public opinion has turned against Israel, so much so that barely 5,000 pro-Israeli supporters showed up in London on Sunday, the day after 500,000 pro-Palestinian supporters marched in the same city, and the same day 400,000 marched on Washington, D.C. This is only making the Zionist regime ever more desperate, which is why Israel and the US government, along with their surrogates in the media, are again hyping up the so-called Islamic terror threat to ratchet up American fears about Islam, Muslims, and Palestinians. This totally made-up nonsense by the Telegraph is meant only to create support and sympathy for Israel. But this headline says it all. A day of jihad is how this network described a global call for peaceful, pro-Palestinian solidarity. But it gets even worse.
When we're looking around the Middle East and the uprisings popping up around Europe and others, they could be sleeper cells right now in America.
Israel is warning tonight of possible attacks on Israelis and Jews abroad. An Israeli student here at Columbia University was hit with a stick. Now,
a stick? They report this while ignoring how Muslims are being stabbed to death in their homes, as Palestinian students are shot by pro-Israel supporters and violently assaulted in the streets. Never does the media talk about the threat of Zionist terrorism, because pro-Israel governments have reserved the word terrorism exclusively for Muslims and Palestinians. And while we're speaking about terrorism, it's not beyond Israel's imagination to stage a false flag terrorist attack in the West to regain Western sympathies, because we know Israel has done this before, like it did in 1954 when members of the Israeli intelligence bombed Western and Egyptian institutions in Egypt, hoping the attacks could be blamed on members of the Muslim Brotherhood or the Communist Party. And we also know that Israel lied about Arab government plans to invade Israel to justify its illegal invasion and occupation of the Palestinian territories in 1967. So I urge you to be aware of future false flag attacks that will be used to frame and vilify Palestinian resistance. But with all of that said, more and more Westerners are rejecting Israeli propaganda, because more and more young people are turning away from the Zionist influence mainstream media and towards unfiltered and non-bastardized sources of news and information to learn about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict.
Propaganda that would have been believed in the past is being challenged by tech-savvy youth who use social media networks as their search engines and news feeds. In fact, the abundance of pro-Palestinian messaging on TikTok forced the social media giant to deny allegations that its algorithms were deliberately promoting such content. TikTok pointed out that young people simply support Palestine much more than they do Israel. And the data backs it up. TikTok's Free Palestine hashtag has 25.5 billion views, in contrast with Stand With Israel's 440.4 million.
And we are thankful that young people are also flocking to our program, where they learn about the deceit that underpins Israeli propaganda and the lies the Zionist state manufactures about Islam. But that's my time for today. Please don't forget to subscribe to this channel, and we kindly ask you please support our effort to expose and confront injustices in the Muslim world by becoming a member of this show at patreon.com/CJWerleman. This show is made possible only because of the support we receive from our patrons and YouTube members, and we can't thank them enough. It's just a simple reality that we can't produce, sustain, and grow this show without your help, and we offer exclusive benefits to those who do. But for now, good night, good morning, wherever you are, and stay blessed.